Hey all. So what I want to talk about today is chapter 2. I thought I'd walk you through it like I walked through with you guys in chapter 1. And then what follows will be some narrated slides, some lecture notes, some quizzes, that sort of thing. This is to get the ball rolling and to give you again a sort of a model for what a good reading of the text might look like. Okay, so the American Revolution, the founding of the United States of America. Pretty foundational for this course, right? Where did things begin? Well, you could go back, I suppose, to the Big Bang some billions of years ago, but we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to talk about the events that lead up to the American Declaration of Independence in 1776, which of course eventuates in the American Revolution, and America is successful in breaking free of the mother country, Great Britain, by 1787 or thereabouts. Or that's when we get the Constitutional Convention anyway. So, and then from there, right, we roll into the creation of the Constitution. All right, so that's the big picture. What are some of those events that lead up to revolution? Well, I'll tell you what, check out my slides, because I do a pretty comprehensive job on that. Our book handles it in a briefer version, which is fine. I want you to get both. All right, so in terms of what our text covers, right, they say, well, and what they don't mention specifically is it was the French and Indian Wars on the western frontier of the colonies that really sparks Great Britain to demand more revenue from the American colony. Right, the French and Indian Wars were wars fought largely by the British on the western frontier of the colonies, right, which were nestled on the east coast of North America, to beat back French efforts to colonize North America and Native American resistance to the colonies. Right, and so Britain is successful in those wars, but those wars cost a lot of money, right? You're sending troops and materiel all the way from Great Britain to North America and then moving them west towards the Appalachian Mountains. So their argument is, okay, up till now, we've really just used the colonies here in North America for raw materials, which I cover that in my slides, mercantilism. But now we want revenue as well. We want some payback on our investment in the colony. That's how it works, right? With the mother country back in the days of colonialism. And these satellites, these colonies, is, hey, we're the mother, you're the child, you're there for our benefit. And so, right, they start to impose taxes and other sorts of legislation to make good on their investment. And Americans increasingly feel less tied to the mother country, right? As I covered in the slides, more and more are native born by the mid 18th century, and so we don't have as much emotionally invested in the relationship, and I think it makes us more prone to sort of go off when we feel like we're being treated unfairly. From Britain's point of view, they were being eminently fair. From our point of view, they were being eminently unfair. It was just a clashing points of view. Maybe like Democrats and Republicans in America today. Just very little common ground. So, right, we got a series of acts. I covered those, I think, in the study guide. And it eventuates in a growing sense of the need for rebellion. And that eventuates, right, after what's covered in the book in some detail, the Declaration of Independence in 1776. I'm just going to actually just go through here. Notable about that, right, because this is one of my favorite stories. Jefferson is authorized to write that first draft of the Declaration. And in it, among other things, he takes King George to task for engaging in the slave trade, which is true, right? British merchants were engaged in securing black people. I think it's the west coast of Africa, and then shipping them across the Atlantic Ocean to places like America to be sold into slavery. Right, so it's true that Britain was engaged in the slave trade for profit, but of course, isn't that a bit of a chutzpah for Jefferson to say we condemn King George for being engaged in the slave trade when we were even more engaged in the slave trade. We were the biggest, I think the biggest community sort of fueling the slave trade. So, right, the Continental Congress, I think in this case, in the form of Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, they're like, dude, you can't be condemning King George for that. That gets a little too close to home. So they have to revise it. And they come up with some other indictments of King George. So it eventuates in this declaration, and we're off to war. And again, I cover that in some detail in the slides. There's our newest addition there, Rescue Dog. I always say, what is the, she got a little bit of a cold, brought it with her from the Animal Foundation. Adopt, don't shop. We're certainly big proponents of that ethic. The dog doesn't know what breed they are. Dog is a dog. And often the crossbreeds are, of course, much healthier than the purebreds, which, some people maybe don't take fully into account. All right. And then, right, we're ultimately successful in that effort for reasons that I lay out in those slides. And during that revolution, right, the Continental Congress creates the Articles of Confederation. Ultimately a failed governing document. Although, remember, it did work well enough to get us through the war and beyond. So we shouldn't be too hard on the Articles, but it was pretty dysfunctional, right? Most critically, of course, because it placed too little power at the national level and put way too much power at the state level. We were like a loose collection of 13 states, almost like 13 nation states. And that ultimately proved to be unfeasible for an emerging nation state called the United States of America. So that didn't get it done. There was a recognition that this was problematic. And Shays' Rebellion in western Massachusetts, angry farmers put down, but a bit of a near-run thing because we didn't have a national army. All you had were state militias. There's a recognition that, oh heavens, this isn't really quite workable. We need to be a United States of America, not a loose confederation. So there's a call for a convention, Philadelphia, 1787, and in this convention, right, we get a relatively strong national government and weaker states. To sum it up very quickly, who were the convention delegates, the conventioneers, as it were? What you'd expect, right, at that time, propertied white guys with high status, sort of what at the time was the American aristocracy. So it's not a cross-section of the American people. Women don't get representation, natives don't get representation, on and on. And that's problematic, right? Because, look, they're going to have a certain point of view. Doesn't mean that they were all of one view. They weren't. Even though they were just, in a sense, homogenous, right? Property white guys. They still have diverse points of view on all sorts of issues. But socioeconomically, right, pretty much on the same page, broadly speaking. So that's problematic, because you're not going to get a governing document that really reflects the views of the American people. This is not we the people broadly understood. This is we the people narrowly understood. Look, in many ways it's a fantastic governing document, but in other ways it's significantly flawed. And we've tried to work that out over our history, as it turns out, both through amendments and by reimagining the language that was used at the time. The living Constitution argument. That's just a fact. Despite some claims for originalism, we mostly haven't done that. But we paid it some attention, but we've sort of combined that with living Constitution. I think of necessity. Oh golly, what does our authors point out? Look, there were three critical decisions here. George Washington is chosen, war hero, to preside over the convention. That helps a lot, right? Prestige and so forth. Not an intellectual. Not well-versed in Enlightenment political theory, not a mover and shaker at the convention in terms of technical details. That wasn't his thing. He was kind of above the fray, right? There, but really as symbolic of the successful war effort and as a war hero. But he helps, I think, give the convention prestige. He helps hold it together. Helps keep people focused. Second, it's held in secret. I mean, people knew it was happening, but the happenings inside that hall in Philadelphia were kept secret. You know, maybe it's apocryphal, maybe it's not, but the story is that the delegates had the windows nailed shut. And this is Philadelphia in like June and July, really hot and humid. So that was a lot to ask, but they thought that was important. Otherwise, you get people listening in at the open windows and spilling the beans. And they didn't want that. They said, look, we're going to keep this on the down low until we had it done. Then we'll release it to the public and we can debate it. It was a smart choice. You know, today we would never accept that, right? That would be seen as way too sketchy. It would just feed conspiracy theorists up the wazoo. But at that time, you could still get away with that sort of thing. And then, right, they decide to trash the articles and start fresh, which was, I think, the correct decision. But what was their grant of authority from the Continental Congress? To amend the articles. They say, well, the hell with that. We're going to go far beyond our grant of authority, and we're going to just trash it, start over. Interesting. One of the reasons they kept it secret. Okay, good stuff. Yeah. And then look, there's, again, I covered this in some detail in the slides here. Our authors do a great job. You know, look, one of the key issues, right, is in terms of the legislative branch. How do we do that? Do we do it each state gets equal representation, or it's done by population? There's the Connecticut or Great Compromise that says, well, we'll do some of both. The Senate will represent each state equally, no matter how populous, no matter how unpopulous, and the House will be done by proportional representation, right? A big state gets way more delegates. Like today, I think California gets more than 50. And then lightly populated states like Wyoming get 1. Okay, so the idea is, right, you give some deference to the sovereignty of each state. Each state gets 2 senators, no matter how big or small. But in the House, there's a recognition of proportional representation. Another issue here covered by our authors quite nicely, the 3/5 compromise, right? One of those dirty little secrets. Treating, for purposes of representation in the House, treating each slave in each state as 3/5 of a person. Right? The southern states demanded that. They said, yeah, these people are not citizens. They are property. They're chattel. But if we don't count them as people in getting representation in the House, we will have very little representation in the House, the southern states. Right? And our authors point out in that chart on page 44, table 2C, states like Georgia, where 35% of the population were slaves. Maryland, 32%. North Carolina, 25.5%. South Carolina, 43%. Virginia, 39%. Right, if they couldn't count them for representation purposes, they were going to get very little representation in the House. So they want it both ways, right? We treat them as if they were citizens for counting, for representation, but then we actually treat them as property. It was chutzpah of the worst sort, really toxic, right? And so that gives the southern states, mostly the slave-owning states, with large numbers of slaves, way more representation than they should have gotten, you could argue. Right? They get a tremendous deal here. And there's 2 other compromises I cover, I think, in the slides. The fugitive slave clause that says if any slave escapes from a slave owner and tries to escape to a free state, that free state is obligated to help get them back to the slave owner in the slave state. So it implicates, right, the North in the institution of slavery. Another big win for the South. And then there was the compromise regarding abolition of the slave trade. The trade, not the institution, but the trade from Africa. We agreed to allow that to be ended by Congress if Congress so chooses, which they did, I think by the year 1808. And so they put it off for some years, some decades. I think it's about 2 decades, right? And some would say that's a big win for the North. We get rid of the slave trade in 20 years or so. But think about it, right? Not really. Because this would increase, because then you're limiting the supply of slaves. That increases the value of slaves that are already here in America. And it increases the holdings in some ways, right, of the slave owners. So again, the South gets a really good deal there. And remember, by 1808, there were, I think, I forget how many, but there were many, many, many hundreds of thousands of slaves by then, possibly millions. I should know that, but I don't. An awful lot. We had plenty of slaves by then. We didn't need the slave trade anymore. Right? And then you get domestic reproduction. So these were called compromises on slavery, but in each of those three cases, the South gets a really good deal. This is right being born in original sin. Other things, right? And broadly speaking, we get a very strong national government for the first time. A really strong Congress, a strong executive branch, and a somewhat strong judicial branch. They're ranked in that order, right? Congress, Article 1, the executive branch, Article 2, the Supreme Court and lower courts, federal courts, Article 3. Boom, boom, boom. Not co-equal, but, somewhat co-equal, if that makes sense. Similar in power, but with Congress at the top, President second, courts third. The states are given less power. We have the supremacy clause, right, that when there's a conflict, national government wins as long as the national government is exercising its enumerated powers. That's a key condition, right, for that supremacy clause. When the national government is properly exercising its listed powers, Articles 1, 2, and 3, and there's a clash with the states, the national government will always win. If, and it's a big if, right, because we are a government of enumerated powers. You need to see them listed in those articles before the national government can use those powers. There's a limit on government. There's in many ways limited government. Powerful but limited, if that makes sense. Checks and balances, right? Shared powers between the three branches. It's often called separation of powers, which is largely true, but they overlap, right? They overlap as well. So the president can nominate people to serve on the federal courts, but only with the advice and consent of the Congress. Congress can pass laws, but the Supreme Court can overturn them. Congress can pass bills, but they don't become a law until the president signs it, and if the president refuses to sign it, Congress can override that veto with 2/3 in both houses, blah, blah, blah. All right? And we get, of course, right, hold on. And then we don't get a Bill of Rights, right? We don't get a Bill of Rights. There's a recognition that maybe we need one, but our work here is done. We don't want to take any longer. We got to get this moving. It's going to be contentious. Let's just get done what we have done. It's very pragmatic. The founders in many ways were very pragmatic. And let's just get it out there. And then if it gets ratified, as soon as that first Congress meets, we'll work on a Bill of Rights. Right? So there's a promise among the delegates that we'll stop here, but we recognize the need for a Bill of Rights, but we'll get to that if it's ratified and when that first Congress meets. And that's exactly what happens, right? And remember, that was a compromise struck at the convention between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Feds supported this document, the Constitution. The Anti-Feds did not. Right? They said it creates too strong of a national government. The states are too weak. The courts are way too strong. The presidency is too strong. Congress is too strong. We don't like any of this. And there's no Bill of Rights. And the Federalists are like, okay, you jerks. The other stuff's all bullshit. But we do recognize the need for a Bill of Rights. We agree with you there. And the Anti-Feds are like, we'll take it. We'll take it. And that's how it works out. All right. All right. Lots of good stuff there about the specific powers given to Congress, not just the ones listed in a sense, but also the idea that you should take a broad approach to those listed powers, the necessary and proper clause or implied powers clause. Right, that we're going to interpret broadly what Congress can do to achieve those listed powers. We're going to lean in that direction every time if we can. Read that Article 1, Section 8 as broadly as possible. Hamilton, the wonderful Hamilton, calls the judiciary the least dangerous branch. Beautiful phrasing. Guy was a damn genius. You also recognize, right, after the Constitution was released to the public, after that hot summer of '87, there was a spirited debate in the nation's newspapers over ratification. And back then, newspapers were either Federalist or Anti-Federalist. Now, people bitch about a partisan press today, fair, but it was really partisan back then as well. Maggie's up into all sorts of no good back there. What's she doing? I don't know. Nothing good. And these editorials in newspapers were published using nom de plumes, names that weren't real. What do you call that? Anyway, pen name. But it was mostly Hamilton, because he was a workaholic and a genius. A little bit by Madison, who was also a genius. Didn't write that many, but the ones he wrote were super important. And then John Jay, who ended up serving later on the Supreme Court. He wrote only a couple, and they weren't that important. Sorry, Jay. So mostly Hamilton, Madison, not many, but very important ones, and then John Jay, not many and not important. And ultimately, right, those editorials win over we the people in a state-by-state vote. You also have, by the way, a collection of editorials on the other side called the Anti-Federalist papers. I have a copy somewhere in my office. Those are less well known because they lost. But they did win, right, the agreement to work on a Bill of Rights upon that first Congress meeting, which is exactly what happens. All right, blah, blah, blah. Checks and balances, right? Checks and balances related to separation of powers that overlap. Checks and balances. Oh, no. Again, I covered that pretty well in the slides. Oh, and there we are at the end. So that's a quick rundown. And then a more detailed version of this can be found in both the lecture notes and the narrative slides. Thanks all.